Three, two, one. All right, this is Into the Absurd, episode 19 with Vincent Trombatore. He's a Juris Doctorate and an attorney at law. He also studied a lot of things in college, and he's kind of a very interdisciplinary guy. He does a lot of things. He's starting businesses. He works in law. He's all over the place. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. Hi, Greg. Thanks. Sure. I guess a little bit about my education background. I have a degree in biology and I have minors in chemistry and political science. So I've studied quite a lot of political science, government, how governments work, especially with my Juris Doctorate in law. And then I have some businesses on the side as well. I say on the side, but I also do business consulting as well as I'm an attorney for businesses, small businesses, and do interactions with and practice in the areas of intellectual property and business law as well. So
yeah, and so like intellectual property, that's copyright and things like that.
Right. So copyrights, trademarks, trade secrets, those types of, I guess, non-physical assets that companies might have that really make, that are important to them.
So with this, so you studied biology. So are you interested at all in the philosophy of science, like bioethics and things like that?
Well, I think bioethics would just be a subset of ethics in and of itself. So I'm interested in ethics and applying ethics to the study of science. Yes. So I've had some dealing. We've taken ethics. I haven't taken per se a whole ethics class in biology or for science, but we've certainly discussed, medical ethics and those types of topics in my studies. So I would say that yes, I'm interested in bioethics or science, the ethics of science.
Yeah, it's kind of a vast topic, but I mean, as far as your studies in law go, I know you're interested in politics. You're interested in why governments fail, like the current problems with democracies. And I know right now in our current political climate, it's extremely polarized, and half of that, or at least probably most of that, is really due to social media and our technology, and kind of all the algorithms kind of have a tendency to cause people to see something and then react, and then when they react to it, it will send you more reactive content. I don't know if you have any commentary on that.
Well, we can comment on that, I guess. Yeah, social media has certainly exacerbated underlying human psychology. I guess the common term now would be psychological hacks, right?
Yeah.
So if you want somebody to act in certain ways, you can press certain buttons to do that. And social media has found a way to do that. So there's whole psychology departments at Stanford that interact with those types of things, that have the whole disciplinary interest in those types of discussions. And they talk about gamifying, software applications. And so they talk about, gamifying these social media platforms. There's been a profound, and want to talk about, one of the issues or the problems with democracies today, and social media has exploited those. I don't think they've caused it, but they've certainly exploited them and made them more readily apparent. Before, it was not as easy to exploit those psychological issues in the human psyche as before.
Yeah, I guess, social media is almost like the highest point that advertising has come to, kind of that that thing that you were telling me the other day about Sigmund Freud's his nephew, was it?
Yes, yes. So Edward Bernays is really he is the intersection between modern psychology and sort of, and in a way, ethics as well. The ideas that Sigmund Freud were discussing in his describing psychology of the human mind really goes back to the same ideas as Plato and Aristotle as to what's real, and then obviously Hobbes and Locke discuss of what's human nature, what is, what's man's natural state. And Edward Bernays was Freud's nephew, and he came to America from Austria, I believe from Austria. Freud's from Austria, I believe. His nephew was from Austria as well. So he came to America and started, basically he started using propaganda, or what they called propaganda at the time, which he termed as public relations. So the term public relations is really, he's the father of the public relations industry. And so he used Edward Bernays used Freud's concepts of these baseline psychological, the human psychological baseline to really make people buy things. And he also wrote books besides marketing and purchasing. And when he turned it to a consumer product, he used it with the government as well. He was a consultant with the U.S. government during the, I believe during the League of Nations discussions with Woodrow Wilson. And so he used his concepts of how to negotiate and change people's minds on certain things based on Freud's psychology, psychological principles at the time. They were kind of, now Freud has often been repudiated in his theories, but a lot of them stand true today. Some of his basic foundational concepts stand true. Obviously, some of the more racy things that he talked about, not everything's linked to sex, right?
Yeah.
They kind of disproved that, but people's basic instincts, and really the basic instincts that Freud talks about, the hierarchy of needs and psychologically, are really the hierarchy of needs for a government and what a government are there for. They're there to protect you. They're there for society. And they're there to help you find your purpose or help you exploit, find your purpose or make life meaningful, or not help you do it, but to enable you to do that. And that's what we see in the U.S. Constitution, and discussed also in the Declaration of Independence. But the U.S. Constitution from the very outset discusses really common defense, promotes general welfare, secure the blessings of liberty, so life, liberty, and happiness. And so the founders took a lot from Rousseau. They took a lot from John Locke. They took a lot from Montesquieu, and those ideas of justice and liberty and freedom, but also really the baseline things that government and people need, which are defense and general welfare, tranquility, peace. And so those are all things that every person wants and really needs in a psychological way in order to pursue their happiness. And so the way that Edward Bernays and Freud really are at the cross section for the last 100 years. They set things in motion, right? At least Bernays did set things in motion that really affected democracies all over the world. So Bernays really wanted to, he actually wrote a book called Engineering Consent, where the idea was that governments could really engineer the people to do the will of the people, as you talk about with Rousseau talks about general will. And so he used that, Bernays used that concept and discussed the concept through manipulation in a way, through manipulating the general will to whatever the rulers wanted, the people in power wanted to do. And we're in a place now where social media gives people in power, people who want to be in power, a platform to more easily sway the general will, or at least parts of it. So it's being used. Social media is not just being used in the United States problematically, but it's being used all over Western Europe. So democracies across the world, and there's studies have shown this, that democracies across the world have been in decline since probably, I guess, last 10 years or so, more particularly after 2012 or so. But and it's ramped up in the last 5 or 6, all based on the explosion and use of social media.
Yeah, and it's, I guess, like the biggest part of this problem is that, yeah, we have a democracy, and yes, we can go and we can vote for president. And I mean, there's lots of problems associated with this. But the main thing that you're kind of talking about is that, we have the choice to vote for whoever we want. We have the choice to make these decisions. But if our decisions are being heavily influenced by the people in power, then do we really have like the freedom to make these decisions? Are we really making the decisions, or are they?
Well, right. Rousseau talks about informed consent of the general will, and so everybody has to be in. Rousseau talks his theory and the way that he really envisions, I guess, this utopian government or peoples, is that it was a direct democracy where every citizen was involved and discussed, the laws that were being passed and the rules that were going to be passed and the regulations, and was involved directly in their democracy in a very high level. Everyone's their own representative, and he thought that if you weren't your own representative, that you were going to be exploited by someone else that was speaking on your behalf. We didn't go down that path. The United States didn't go down that path, and as far as I know, I don't think there's any direct democracies. And Rousseau even just says that there was only a couple of examples that he could give that would direct democracy really work. It only works in a very small communities. And so obviously it's not going to work here in the United States or many other places at this point in time, because the complexity of governments are expanding instead of contracting. And it's the governmental structures, I say governmental structures, but rules and treaties between countries are expanding. We have regional governments all over the world. I say governments, but regional agreements between countries all over the world, and parties. You say parties. Parties are states, as they would say in the Enlightenment era. Locke and Rousseau would say the state. But we have countries that have agreements all over the world now where they're regional governments. There's, NAFTA, there's the EU, ASEAN in Asia. I believe there's, I'm going to get the acronym wrong, but I think it's Mercosur in South America. And there's a South American, there's an African continental type of, it's not necessarily a government, but it's a legislative body and or a body that talks about treaties. And a lot of it is based on, it starts off as a marketplace, as a way to control and or increase trade among the countries and among the peoples. And actually, Montesquieu says that he stated that really morals, man became gentler as we started to trade among each other. And if you take that out to our current situation, it's true. And that was really the EU was set up in a way that there wouldn't be any more world wars started from the European countries to stop the wars that had been going on for centuries in Europe. He said, if we're a one marketplace, we're not going to fight each other. And so that's kind of a Montesquieuian philosophy or an idea, theory, and it's worked out so far with Europe, and other places, other parts of the world have put it in place as well. So, things are going to a worldwide, I say worldwide, and we have the World Trade Organization as well. But there's mitigating factors as we go back to the social media issues. There's mitigating factors of democracy and these types of treaties or agreements, peaceable agreements between countries that, countries not in democracy, tyrannies, or, those different types of tyrannies, right? There's rule by, Cicero, Aristotle, they all talk about different types of, rules. So you rule by many, rule by one, rule by many, rule by a few, rule by one. And then, so going from a democracy, normally it's a step, either it's a stepwise function that you go by rule by many, rule by a few, and then you go rule by one. We are sort of a rule by few now. We think that a lot of people think we are a democratic republic, and there's a lot of people that don't quite understand that, I guess. But so we have representative government, but in the United States, there's been, I would say, since probably some studies have come out and shown that really the United States is really ruled by only a few families. So we're becoming more of an oligarchy than we are a democracy or a democratic republic. And one of the issues around that and things pushing social media are the corporations. So problems with democracies. So if you look at how the US government was set up, the founding fathers were very deep students of some of the philosophers I've mentioned so far: Aristotle, Cicero, Rousseau, Locke. A lot of the ideas, the New Age ideas, but the Enlightenment ideas of all men are created equal, the idea that we're endowed with inalienable rights, those are all Enlightenment ideas. The structures of the government itself were pulled from different places, and sort of Cicero and Aristotle and Plato. Cicero is a later he's a Roman orator and Roman philosopher. He took from Aristotle and Plato and Socrates as well, but they structured the government. They even talked about the balances in a way. The checks and balances weren't necessarily their idea, but they had the baseline foundation for the idea to be brought up on. And so the founders drew out a system of government that had Enlightenment theory of personhood, of who we are as man, and then structured the government with the best ideas of humankind and the worst ideas of humankind. What is the worst humankind is really what Hobbes talks about. We're all in a state of war all the time. We all want what everybody else has. And so in a state of, quote, state of nature, you're completely free to do whatever you want. We're all equal to be tyrants over everyone else, over another. And so you could kill someone in a state of nature. If there was no laws, a state of nature was no laws or no type of government, what could you do? You could do anything. You could steal, kill someone, and just to get, and they talked about basically wanting things and really meeting your hierarchy of needs, right? So if you wanted property, reasonable, so property and things like that, steal some from someone. So Hobbes saw the idea as, well, the people need a protector. And so that's basically his idea in Leviathan and why monarchies are here. why he liked the monarchy, sovereignty that way. The absolute sovereign was a protector, basically, and a arbiter of people. So really, they kind of used, the founders sort of used the idea that what's the best way of keeping everyone in check? Well, if everyone is overly ambitious and everyone wants the most honor, I guess, or all the power, how do you keep one from getting the other? How do you keep power from being pooled in one area? Well, you give checks on each one, and so they created the checks and balances and gave us the identity through our founding documents, both the Declaration of Independence and our Constitution, of the goal of what humankind really should be. So the best and the worst, and they kind of merged it together in a very, obviously, two very elegant documents, beautiful documents that we have as our foundation for our government, and our people's, really our ethos, right? So our ethos really comes out of those documents, and they're beautiful, but at the same time they're contradictory, because they use the worst case scenario and things that that Bernays and Sigmund Freud talked about. It's really the base human experience, psychological. What's human going to do? They use that because they knew how people were, and they merged it with idealistic forms of equality that the world had never seen in a government before. So what the founders didn't know was, really, they didn't know the future, and they didn't know the power that corporations would have. And so corporations, they gave power to the legislators. The legislators are supposed to be the most powerful body. Now, there's been books written about how the executive, in our case, the president, has really wrested power from the rest of the other two bodies of government and taken over. And some of that goes to the fact that we've divided our people into factions. The party system that we have, there's a two-party system, and really there's no way for a third party to come into play in the United States. Very small chance of that happening, and the probability is very low. And so people talk about voting for a third party. It's almost basically, it's not quite throwing your vote away, but it's close.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like
a protest vote. So
yeah,
it's a protest vote at that point. You can say that you voted, but you didn't vote for either one of the main parties. And so John Adams and the founding fathers were quite terrified of factions and parties, although they helped create them in a way. With Thomas Jefferson and Adams and Hamilton kind of created the factions, but they were worried about factions because factions were more easily controllable. If there was a bunch of different factions, it's less likely that they could be controlled by a small group of individuals. So obviously money it really has a lot of power today, and we have some really bad Supreme Court decisions that have given more weight to money in recent time. Citizens United is, if anybody is the main one.
What is Citizens United?
Citizens United basically says that money is equal to speech and political speech. And so you can do whatever you want with your money to affect political speech in a very baseline way, or how it's not exactly what the ruling says, but that's how it's been put into place and how it's been used since, I believe it's 2010, with the ruling. They took limits off of how much you could spend, limits on. There were some regulations about anonymous donorship, and so influencing elections anonymously, for instance. They stripped all of those regulations and said that there's no regulations on political speech as far as money goes. And in a way, they've even stripped down political speech to there's very little. But there's some of the, you know, unless you're really advocating intimate violence or lawlessness, they're not going to stop you. They won't stop a politician from speaking. The only case of in recent times of a politician being convicted for political speech was Eugene Debs in the early 1900s, who said that people should, you know, evade or ignore the draft for World War One, and he was imprisoned. So that was the last time political speech had really been constricted, and there's good and bad things from that. But if you're using political speech in a way that debases democracy, right? And that's really a topic today, and necessarily want to get there, but we don't have to. But if you use political speech in a way that debases and endangers democracy, how free should that speech be? So that's an interesting question, and I think that's a question that it's left to our politicians today. But it is one of the issues with corporations is that they can now use their influence, their money, to influence elections. They can use their influence to influence their money to influence politicians. They can give unlimited political contributions. No one needs to know about it. They laid out recently, I want to say it was the Senator White House laid out a scheme and where that he tracked contributions really from unknown sources, but there was contributions into these funds, these PACs, political action committees, 501c3s, tax exempt entities that influence politicians and politics and political speech, and basically writing on behalf of unknown donors to influence Supreme Court decisions. You know, so the corporate power has come in and displaced the checks and balances that the founders set up, and our government is set up with norms. The one thing that really indicates a strong democracy, there's obviously the structure in of itself, the rules, the laws, regulations inside the government. But there's soft power in democracies with institutions and norms that are not necessarily written down, but are respected. So something like the best example of that would be George Washington practically could have been the president for the rest of his life. In fact, there were several people who wanted to be president for the rest of his life. And in that case, he would have just been another European monarch. So he didn't want to do that. He resigned after his second term and said he wasn't going to run for president again. It was not law until until Franklin Roosevelt won a third term, died in office, and then immediately after his death, they made a constitutional amendment to limit presidencies to 2 terms. So over 100 years worth, well, more than that, but over 100 years of a political norm where no one had run for more than 2 terms. So political norms are important in democracies, and so
because it might not be a law, but the person who's running for office will break certain ethical laws, right? Laws that aren't written, that just are unethical to do,
right?
To add on to kind of the problems of democracy and the corporations, it's almost like they're it's damaging to the politicians themselves, because some of these people get into office, and they're an idealist, right? And they want to change the world, and then some corporations like, hey, here's some money if you can do this, right? And then that's when the corruption begins, right?
Right. And so the U.S. government, the founders, had this idea before, or they were aware of that potential problem. A lot of during the colonial period and really Enlightenment up until, I would say, even up until recent times up until modern times. Honor, legacy, those were ideas of chivalry, but honor and legacy, I guess, were big influences in people's lives, especially if you were of the aristocratic class. And so they used honor and legacy, as, for instance, in Athens, in order to pay to really to enact taxation. Their taxing policy was a progressive tax policy, was that if the government needed something, they would go to the rich and ask for a tax. They would, you know, and the idea was that it was your duty and your honor to be able to do that. And the idea that we have for progressive taxation today comes from, and that's where progressive taxation is, where really you pay by the means, right? So your amount that you're paying is by the means, and that's why we have tax brackets today. You know, if you fall under a certain amount, you don't pay any tax. If you fall on a next amount up, you pay a little bit of tax, and so forth and so forth. And the idea and the ethical idea and the moral, the equality, the just idea, the justice idea that the Athenians came up with was that those who had more had benefited from the government and the entire community more so than everyone else. And so that their success, if you want to call it success, wasn't necessarily on their own merit. It was on the merit of everyone else, all the community working together in a way. And so that was the political philosophy, I guess the ethical or the philosophical idea behind taxation in Athens, right? And they used, kind of guilted or shamed the rich into paying for these, paying for roads and bridges and aqueducts and things like that. Not in Athens, or aqueducts in Athens, but and so that was how taxation worked, progressive taxation. And I think that theory, that idea really exists. I think it really should play today. And I think you mentioned before, or how do you use philosophy in modern times? So this is one of the times you can do that. The philosophical argument that those who have more really have been the beneficiary of what everyone in the community has been working towards, and it's really by a lottery. It's sort of by a lottery. And there's John Rawls has a book recently. He wrote the book. It's published in 1971. Theory of Justice. And so he looks at all of the current modern day inequality. You hear a lot today from politicians that talk about, economic inequality. Rawls looked at that. And so his idea was that, how do you know if you're in a just society? He had this thought experiment. I don't know if you're familiar with it. He had this thought experiment where called the veil of ignorance, right? Do you live in a just society? And the thought experiment goes, if before you were born, you understood and knew everything that was happening in down there and where you're going to be born, and you were able to choose, but you couldn't choose. It was a lottery system. But would you go into the lottery system knowing your percentage chances of what might be going on at the time, and if you can say no, then your society is probably unjust. Now, I probably didn't do I didn't do John Rawls's veil of ignorance justice there, but I think that's the overall idea, is whether or not, and his idea, and he really talks, that idea it dates back to these other philosophers that I mentioned, was that your birth is really a luck of the draw. You're rich or poor by lottery system. You have no ability to change that. It's just what you were naturally endowed with by
Mhm.
chance. And so human dignity shouldn't be by chance.
With that kind of lottery system, a society is unjust if it's more likely that you'll be born into a really bad situation than it is that you're not, right?
Well, I think today we look at justice and we think about there's two types of justice, right? But there's two types of justice, or three if you look at it. There's Aristotle talks about three types, but you can look at really justice of laws, and then there's justice of equality. So if we're looking at equality, and what's equality? Not everybody. It's obvious that not everyone's going to be born, and shouldn't be expected. Everybody's going to be rich or born rich, and so I think, and this goes down into some of the psychological issues of human psychology. Everybody wants to be rich, um, and they're either mad they're not rich or they want to be rich, and that's some human psychology, and that's one of the exploitation points that people can use is like that psychological factor. People want to be rich. They want to have. Really, it's not nothing about wanting to be rich in of itself. It's a means to the ends of having your needs met well easily, right? Some of it is, right? So there's the vanity portion of it, the thumus, as I think it wasn't Aristotle, it was Plato, talked about the thumus, that idea, that drive for glory and vanity and fame, and that's kind of what the Athenians used to get people to pay taxes, right? It was that thumus. There's a little more into it about thumus, but that was part of it. But people want to be rich because they want their needs met, you know.
Hmm.
So justice, I don't think it's people have an unreal expectation of what's possible for themselves. Sometimes we're not all going to be billionaires. We're not all going to be millionaires, for instance, right? There's only 1% now of the population, or even less, is millionaires or whatever. But if everyone has the same opportunity, that's not a millionaire or not a rich person, if everyone has the same opportunity to put themselves in a position to do so, all things equal, then you can say that perhaps that is a just society.
Hmm. And that's kind of what the founding fathers envisioned when they, when they wrote the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. They wanted a land of opportunity, right?
Right, land of opportunity, and the pursuit of happiness.
Hmm.
You are all equal to pursue happiness to get, as equal as one another. Right. Of course, there's the issues of your ability to pursue happiness from other endowment, right? So the luck of the draw genetically, right?
Hmm.
But those biological issues aside, or even shouldn't stop you. Even that shouldn't stop you from pursuing the happiness that you want, and given the ability to do so and have the opportunity to do that. That's where Rawls would say, well, obviously, yeah, people here, in the United States, for instance, there's injustice everywhere. The opportunity or the inequality among the classes, and America doesn't like to talk about class system. We don't think we're in a class system, but we are.
Hmm.
It's well defined, but there's the mixed government in a way, and really what who was there was some of these philosophers talk about mixed government was talked about by Aristotle, and it's kind of what we have today is mixture between really a mix between all three forms, few, many, and one, right? So that's a mixed government, but a large middle class of people gives really the best government, because most people that are I say satisfied, but everyone's understanding and they've all had equal access to have a role and their say and have their voice heard. So that, if everyone has their voice heard, everyone has equal weight, everyone has equal opportunity. It's about as just as human society can be, right?
Yes.
So we're getting there. We're very slowly getting there, and how does Aristotle talks about some of the way he puts it, but it's basically there's disparities of both sides, right? So you have or it vacillates, right? And so there's some literature that talks about that as well. Some poems that talk about the swinging pendulum. It's, William Butler Yeats has a poem on it that discusses the swing of the pendulum of history and time. And really, if we look at history of man, we look at liberty and freedom vacillates between highs and lows, and perhaps one day it will stop. I guess I say stop, but we'll get into a middle place to where that's kind of what we're looking for is somewhere in the middle that everyone has the same opportunity. Not everybody has to be rich, not everybody has to be poor, but the middle class, there's a large middle class that have all the same opportunities and have a good, decent standard of living. So I think that would be I think when we're looking at what justice is today and what's a equal society today, that's kind of what the goal is, I think. The difficulty there is that the laws are being made and drawn up that are only benefiting a certain class of people, and it's the corporations, really. And those are the ones who are skewing all the laws to benefit them. And at the same time, not only is it benefiting them, it's also pouring more money into their pockets by benefit.
Yeah.
And so, there's the last 50 years worth of economic theory was that corporations' only goal is to produce profits. Well, if it's only produce profits and there's no other considerations and that's not only is it it's a theory, it is the law. It's actually as long as they're showing that they're trying to do the best for the stakeholders and the shareholders, CEOs can get away with almost anything.
Yes.
Almost.
Have you ever heard of Dr. Chris Ryan?
No, I don't think so. Doesn't ring a bell.
He wrote Sex at Dawn and Civilized to Death. And he kind of talks about this idea of corporations almost having a life force of their own, right? They're like this thing that their only goal is to gain revenue, right? Gain profit, get more and more money. And when you work for a corporation, they kind of, so like corporations have this, they kind of hack into you, hey, like we need to make as much money as possible, right? And I mean, that makes sense, but when you take that into a global or national scale, it becomes problematic with all these corporations trying to get as much money as possible. It can significantly reduce the quality of life of the people of a nation.
Yeah, of course, and obviously when they're sucking up all the potential revenue and wealth of the people, then obviously everyone's standard of living is going to decrease. But when you look at, say, just to go a little bit of background on corporations are never meant for this type of to be these money vehicles, I guess you'd say. Corporations were originally used to divest risk from the shareholders and be a vehicle of pooling money and pooling resources to accomplish some sort of merchant goal, right? So a lot of really early corporations were, you have the tea companies, right? So the British tea companies were trading in India, and you have certain, so corporations in the colonies, the American colonies, to establish, colony, their forts here and some land, and receive lands, and then take some of the resources, start trading back with Britain. So really, and they were given these grants by the governments to do this thing for the good of the people, for the welfare of the rest of the community, for the general welfare. And that was the general idea. The real philosophy was that you could do this. We'll allow you to form this group of really consortium of money, and you can pull it in this vehicle, this juridical vehicle that we call a corporation, and we'll reduce your risk. You won't have personal liability. The liability will fall on the corporation, but it has to be for the public welfare. That idea is gone away, and now we're only left with this vehicle being used for monetary gain for the shareholders. Right. So the public welfare idea is gone. The general welfare idea and purpose for these corporations is gone. If you start reinstituting the general welfare, then you can start shutting down. You could shut down. I mean, I think it's a drastic move, but things that you could have more of a judicial backing and I guess, jurisprudence to start saying that you're damaging the country, you're damaging our resources, you're damaging the people and community around you. You have to stop. It gives us a more, I guess, it would give legislators a more, in a way, more ethical and moral footing to start regulating companies. And obviously, that's what they don't want. The corporations don't want regulation, so they can do all these things to extract money from their consumers, from the consumers that purchase their products, or the governments that allow them to extract resources from their lands and our communal land. So regulations, I guess, if you look at economies and the market, and if you look at economies in a way that are akin to ecosystems, right? So biological ecosystems. There are levels of there's levels of consumers in the ecosystem. You have prey, you have the herbivores, right? If something's unchecked, kind of like the balance of powers are unchecked, one of those entities, one of those beings, animals, goes haywire, and you get things like, a good example is the nutria rat in Louisiana. I'm from New Orleans, and so South Louisiana has been plagued by the nutria rat, which is a invasive species from South America, and really doesn't have any check. There's no large, the animals that would be prey to them. There are prey. I mean, they do have those animals here in Louisiana, but the real check on the nutria rat in South America was drought season. And so their numbers would dwindle during drought. During the drought, they don't have that here in Louisiana. There's no drought in Louisiana. Well, maybe with global warming, there might be soon, but climate change, there might be starting to have droughts, but the wetlands are wet and warm all year round. And so the nutria rat there's no check on its ability to procreate. And so they are eating our swampland out of house and home. They're literally just destroying the swamp. Corporations in a marketplace are similar. When they are unchecked, they can go out and really gobble up all the money and all the resources, and they can stifle competition. And so that's their goal, right? So their goal is to become on the monopoly. I mean, every company wants to be the one source of goods for that market. Mm-hmm. So really, the goal of every, I mean, if your goal is to only is to accomplish is to receive money, then money is the food, right? So they're going to eat up as much money as they can. And if you're a monopoly, you're head of that ecosystem. Regulations help control that, right? Antitrust acts, right? The Sherman Antitrust Act, when the U.S. government started breaking up corporations for being monopolies. They had gotten too big. Well, why did they get too big? Because there was no regulations, right? And how do that's the checks and balances of economies are regulations by the government. Letting companies go, having no checks or balances is not a good idea. And we see the results of that. The economy, our resources, our environment have really seen very damaging results from that. We have regulation was a major problem with many of the catastrophes, environmental catastrophes, like the BP oil spill, for instance, in 2010. They were left alone to regulate themselves in a way, and that's what happened. And we have catastrophes like that. So regulating industry is akin to keeping checks on a balanced ecosystem. So balance is important. I think balance is important everywhere, really. A balance of power in government, and economy, and ecosystems, biology as well. And so I use, when I think of the way I think about human systems is the way I think about natural systems. Natural systems need to be harmonious and in balance, and so do human systems. We need to balance our natural drive for stuff, right? Natural drive for property, our natural drive for fame, with the higher ordered moral ethics of equality that our founding fathers talked about. And so we have gotten well away from equality, thinking that individualism can solve for the communal higher ordered communal thinking, that somehow we can make everything individual and personal, and it's going to solve for the communal issues that we have, or the equality issues. And it's not just a poor philosophical argument, it's also it's not seen in data and statistics. We've got 50 years of statistics that show that unregulated corporations amass massive amounts of money and create dramatic amounts of inequality. Mm-hmm. Right? Trickle down doesn't work. So we have those systems to show. We have data that shows that the trickle down tax theory doesn't work, and it all boils down back. It comes back to equality and justice. And, so the United States has some underlying ethos issues, I think, and the fact that we are imbalanced in our way of thinking on individualism versus communalism, or the whole versus the individual, and we need to balance it out more.
Yeah, I mean, I think the natural state of any system is balance, right? I mean, that's what second law of thermodynamics. Chaos is always increasing, but it's always increasing towards a point of equilibrium, right? And with that being said, if we have an unbalanced system, then it's going to collapse until it is equal, right? Unless we fix it ourselves.
Right. That's right. So yeah, you can use physics here as well. Physics, ecology, they all point to the need for balance. And I think really the American experiment is imbalanced at the moment. And we're in a very dangerous, precarious position with our government, with social media, with the use of these psychological hacks I mentioned before from Edward Bernays, puts democracies all over the world in a very precarious position, and how to balance that out and bring it back from a very large pendulum swing to one direction. And if you look at even the discussion about communism, right? Well, communism is a swing in the opposite direction, right? It's an extreme communal organization with a very top-heavy, singular politic, if you want to use that term, but a very one-party system, and it's all based on, well, the theory of it is based on, the philosophy is based on based on the whole working together, but it's not. No communist country has really ever been placed like it hasn't been put in place in the system that it expounds to say, no one has actually ever followed the philosophy that they talk about. No communist country has done so, really. There always ends up being haves and have-nots, which is not one of the not what their goal is for communism.
Well, there's I think there's a natural strive for power for any living organism. I mean, your natural instinct is to survive, and if you want to survive, then you need to be powerful, right? You need to you need to struggle to survive, right? And struggling takes power, right? And whether that's intellectual, financial, physical, you need power to survive. And if you have a natural instinct to survive, or if you have a natural instinct to obtain power, then, I mean, communism isn't going to work, right?
Communism isn't going to work. Communism isn't going to work just because of the same reasons that the U.S. government or the founding fathers saw. There was the natural inclination for man is to gain power, and these ambitions for people in power to come to power and to gain more power as they get there.
Mm-hmm.
So founding fathers saw the issue and tried to work with it and tried to fix it. I say fix it, but try to mitigate it, right?
Mm-hmm.
No mitigating power really with a single party, which really single party just ends up becoming, it doesn't work. Single party doesn't work because it is becoming a totalitarian system or a very small oligarchy. And that's what they have in some of China, for instance, is very oligarchical power structure, and is ruled by reduction of personal freedoms and ruling by fear. So I am thankful that we're not under that structure.
Yes,
but our democracy has some flaws, and they're being exploited currently, and it's our job I think it's a job in the next several decades to fix it.
Well, we'll see what we can do in the next few years, right?
It might take longer than that, but I'm hopeful, and I think we can.
Yeah. Next few decades, maybe centuries, maybe never.
Hopefully not centuries.
Yeah.
But I think Rousseau talked about informed consent, and the founding fathers talk about informed consent. And education is important. Really, it's informing ourselves of what's going on around us and taking ourselves out of the bread and circus that are, the Romans talked about bread and circuses controlling the crowds and the mobs, taking ourselves out of the entertainment cycles, right? And really informing ourselves on what's going on around us is going to help us, is going to lead us, hopefully, to informing ourselves and creating spaces for people to vote differently and choose different sets of politicians. We have the power to remove anybody we want every 2 years in Congress. They're up for re-election every 2 years. So we have the ability to vote out anybody we want. We can keep complaining, but people that complain and don't vote, they're not helping themselves. They're not helping themselves. They're not helping their community. So but it's all that desire to, even that desire, and this is where the social media problem comes in. Even people who want to inform themselves can get sucked into these rabbit holes of misinformation, false information, propaganda, that will skew their reality, skew reality and the facts that they're making their decisions on. And so they're not making informed consent at that point because they don't have all the right data. You can't give informed consent if you don't have the right data. So that's one reason why social media is so dangerous, because it's skewing what general will is through something that's not informed consent. People aren't performing. They think they are informed and voting, giving informed consent with their vote, but they're really not. Some of it's their fault. Some of it's not their fault. Some of it's they're mentally being exploited psychologically because of some of the baseline desires and needs for people. They're being exploited in that direction. And goes back to Edward Bernays. He taught us how to do that. So.
Yeah, you kind of need to protect yourself from, well, for one, from false information, but also from manipulative rhetoric.
Sometimes it's not easy to spot it, but you're right. So the spotting manipulative rhetoric, or even data that, and that's being trained in science first, and even political scientists today are statisticians oftentimes, but being trained in how to spot good information and bad information as coming with a science background is important. And so I don't think our educational systems teach people how to do that well enough. Obviously, it's not well enough today, but I don't think we're taught to think very well. We're not taught. We are taught in our schools to memorize things, memorize bits and pieces of information, but not how to think about it. And it's really how you think about the things, how you think about those pieces of information that really makes the difference. Anybody can, people can memorize things all the time. People memorize all kinds of different things, but it's how you interact those pieces of information with other bits of information that's really important. So synthesizing information together, and how to think about information. In a mathematical, if you would just give mathematical way, you can't equal A and B equals C. You can't figure that out from the pieces. We're not being taught well enough.
Yeah.
And so spotting some of these pieces is really difficult, because what they do is, these pieces, they will skew something to, they'll skew it in a way that will grab your attention. It'll then reinforce something that you already believe, and then make a connection that doesn't make any sense to something else. And so you see there's these memes all over the place. Mostly on Facebook is a good place for all this stuff, really. Social media in general, but Facebook is one of the worst in distributing these propaganda memes, really, just false information.
Yeah.
And you see them all over the place. They make statements that are, either they're untrue, they're making assumptions, and then the bottom line is something that's radical, and just doesn't have any connection between the other statements above it, right? A and B do not equal X, right? A, B, C equals C, but it's so worded well enough to where you're already reading it, and if you believe the things, if you agree with the other things that were stated, they get you to the last bottom line idea. And they're like, well, yeah, of course that makes sense. But if you take those things out of context, you wouldn't necessarily think about, oh, well, no, I wouldn't do that, So, but it leads people to think that those things are okay. And so it's all, some things that they broach ideas, and they get you to see ideas that if you were just talking about it with somebody, they wouldn't necessarily think was okay. But if you see it in a meme, you might have a reaction there, oh, no, I wouldn't do that. That doesn't make any sense. We don't want that. You see it again. You see the other friends posting it, or you see it's posted a couple of times. You're like, oh yeah, I don't like that. But you see it again, and it'll wear you down psychologically, to where it basically the stimulus, you're numb, right, to that particular stimuli or that concept or idea. You've been numb to it, and so you're accepting of it, right? It's a psychological. It's really it's going back to Bernays and Freud, So social media is dangerous to democracy, unfortunately, and we've seen that. I don't know if it's I think it may or may not be the biggest issue. I didn't think it was until recently, but it is. Of the two, we have out of control corporations and social media together is just very dangerous place for democracy all over the world.
Well, it's like a polarity machine, right? It's an anger, a polarity, and a attention machine, right? All geared towards selling you things.
They're trying to sell you something, and necessarily not always trying to sell you a thing, but they're trying to sell you an idea, right?
Mm-hmm.
Exactly, and it's polarity. It's us versus them. It's very tribal based, and it talks about them being, the bad guys. Whereas if you just talk to those other people, you probably have more in common with them than you do the people who are trying to tell you that you don't have in common with them.
Yes, definitely.
And that concept's been used a lot throughout history and time. It's us versus them, where, well, why aren't we against you instead?
Yeah.
Well, and I think that's the point.
Yeah, I mean, they're kind of like they're pitting us against each other when really we should be against them up there, not us down here.
Right. And you look at, and that's really, it's kind of how power gets exploited upwards. It's saying, well, what classes or what groups need to form or come together to oppose tyrannical power. And so if the power can get more power through, allying themselves with people that weren't necessarily be allies with, then they'll stay in power for a lot longer. So that's part of the issue. I mentioned the founding fathers looked at Rome and just, they modeled their idea over really a Roman Republic, but they wanted to freeze a Roman Republic in a state that was about 50 or 50 years before the Roman Empire, before the Republic fell. And the falling of the Roman Republic, really, it was because of several different, not uprisings, but several different populist groups coming through and changing the way government was run and changing the power structure. So you had several leaders that wanted equality. There were issues. There were current issues about immigration. There was issues about immigration and citizenship. Who could vote? Who could own property? And so those issues, they had a very large, non-citizen base in Rome at the time, and those people really they had a rightful complaint to be included in the government as citizens. And so they had about 2 or 3 different leaders that came through about 100 years before Julius Caesar came through, using similar ideas and tactics politically as these leaders did. They were not necessarily as they didn't use demagogue tactics as much. And Julius Caesar in himself didn't use it much, but what allowed the fall of the Roman Republic were these norms being disrupted. and these demagogues and these populist parties coming up and disrupting the power source, and then allowed for one particular. He wasn't powerful when he started, but Julius Caesar, came in, made allies with other powerful people, and became an emperor and took the power for himself. And so, if we're not careful, that's something that could happen to the United States as well and other democracies across the country or across the world.
Of course, it didn't end well for him.
No, but his son became emperor.
Yeah, that's true.
And the empire, and the Roman Empire lasted for the Roman Empire lasted for until about 450 or so, and then the Byzantine Empire, the other side of the empire, lasted until 1453. So the power kept on going. So we're at a place now in the United States. We should be careful.
Yeah, that's definitely a huge cautionary tale about what we need to worry about as far as our future as a nation, and even our future as just a global economy and a global. There's almost a global government, with not like a real government, but we're all collaborating, and especially with technology and our ability to communicate, there's things that people do in China that affect us all the way over here,
Right. Of course. And then you have, we can talk about a little bit more about Kant, talked about cosmopolitanism, and had this idea really of universality, being a citizen of the world, and having a one world government. League of Nations really was an idea that came from Kant. So we could talk about that. It's longer, but I think we might be almost out of time, huh?
Yeah, it's definitely getting to that that time. Do you have any thing else you'd like to say?
No, I think that's about it. We hit on a bunch of different topics today. The idea that democracy is in a very precarious position should be taken seriously, I think, is probably the ending comment. But I think as Martin Luther King said, the arc of justice, the arc of history bends towards justice. So I think we keep working towards justice and equality, we get there.
Perfect. I like that. Thanks for coming on. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it, Greg.
Cool. And if anyone has any questions, comments, or concerns, just email into.the.absurd.podcast@gmail.com. Thank you for listening.